perform this poem because it has nothing to do with water, nothing to do with flooding, so I've not been able to read it out so far, but in a way it's kind of like the theme tune for the second collection, and there's just a couple of things in it that I'll explain before I read it. The first is the War Boys Inquiry. I don't know if people will have maybe heard of, God, I can't remember his name now, but War Boys was a taxi driver in the UK who was convicted for multiple rape a number of years ago, and it transpired that he'd raped 100, 200 plus women, many of whom had, oh, you can't hear, many of whom had reported the crimes to the police but been ignored for various reasons, often because they'd been drinking and therefore weren't seen as credible. I do not believe in silence. Because tonight, however I try, I cannot get downstairs without waking my daughter. I do not believe in silence. Because of the War Boys Inquiry, because of the 100 plus women he raped, because of the policeman defending the findings, unable to utter the word, this crime, this assault, this category of offence, I do not believe in silence. Because of the stairs and the banisters crack, the sound of the lock on my hand on the door, the 50-tone creak, the magnificent echo of light switch and click. I do not believe in silence. Because of Nedar and everyone's sister, and the man who said, don't be afraid, for the sake of my daughter, because of the burqa, because of the patter of rain, because of 200,000 years of human history, 45 of them my own, I do not believe in silence. For the sake of my arms, the wrists especially, with respect to my legs and my belly and chest, and the comfort long due to my throat. Because of nightclubs at 1 a.m, and shouts in the street, and feet in pursuit, and shops that don't shut, because of sirens and the dealers downstairs, because of Levy and Atmatova, because of the blue-lit prisoner, the itch and the scratch of my pen. I believe in the word. I believe in the scrabble of claws on uncarpeted floors. I believe in my daughter's complaints. I believe in the violin, the E string, the seesawing bow, the cello straining its throat. I believe in the heart and its beat and its beep and the dance of the trace on the screen. I believe in the volume of colour turned up and my blood, which was always too loud. Because of the nights and the sweats and the same rowdy thoughts, because of that one afternoon when I nailed my own voice to the air, and because there was nobody listening, and through it all, birdsong and the sound of cars passing, I do not believe in silence.
So Clare, this poem and a lot of your work, you closely associate with your commitment and your passion to make a difference, to, engineer change in a way, both in a personal spectrum and for those who read your poems and in a public forum. Catharsis is a very simple and glib word in this time, and, India is going through a lot of, their own challenges. So in that sense, how do you feel your poem makes a difference to yourself, and how do you hope it makes a difference to those who read it or hear you?
I could probably answer that question for hours because it's something I'm absolutely passionate about. I had a review of this second collection, Head On, which is maybe the most kind of politically informed collection that I've written. and it was in the Times Literary Supplement in the UK, and they said something really strange like, Clare Shaw is under the unusual belief that poetry changes things. I thought, what a bizarre thing to say. And I put it out on social media, because obviously lots and lots and lots of my friends and contacts either write poetry or read poetry, and I checked out whether I was unusual in believing that poetry changes things. And I'm like, oh, hell, you know, lots and lots of people write poetry and read poetry in order to change and be changed. The kind of journey towards poetry for me is, it's inextricably linked with a journey towards recovery and a journey towards personal survival. So in the poem that I just read, I Do Not Believe in Silence, that poem was written as a response to a book called The Book of Silence. I don't know if anybody's come across that. It was written by a British academic called Sarah Maitland, and it's a fantastic book. And what Sarah does in that book is she reclaims silence as a positive experience. So she kind of starts off on the West Yorkshire Moors, which is where I live, and she ends up in kind of the outer reaches of Scotland, and from there she travels to the Gobi Desert, so she's travelling deeper and deeper into the heart of silence. It's a beautiful book, it's beautifully written, beautifully researched, but I Do Not Believe in Silence was my reaction to the book. Because, you know, firstly, at that very practical level, I cannot actually believe that there is anywhere in the world where true silence exists. Sorry, I was looking at a hand that looked really meaningful there. I thought I was going to go, I do. I know where silence is. Yeah, and I think even if we have kind of the silence of the ears, you know, visually, colour, movement, they feel like a kind of noise. The noise that we have inside our heads, I cannot believe in silence. But I think the world is so full of injustice and suffering and oppression that we can't remain silent, that it's wrong to be silent in the presence of other people's suffering. So for me, yeah, poetry was about a movement towards personal survival. I've referred in the poem to, for the sake of my arms, the wrists especially, with respect to my legs and my belly and chest. And that's a reference to the fact that for many years, the language that I spoke was a language of silence. It was a language of self-injury. So denied the language for the experiences that I'd had, and denied the language for how I felt and what I needed. I kind of turned in on my own body and tried to use injury as a way of expressing what was going on for me. So finding words and finding language that was powerful enough to put those feelings and experiences into words was absolutely transformative and saving for me. So yeah, individually, but absolutely socially, I have the deepest commitment and the deepest faith. Of course poetry changes the world. That's why we see so many poets persecuted or imprisoned because of what they say. And actually there's a line in the poem about the blue-lipped prisoner. Did anybody understand the reference to Akhmatova and the blue-lipped prisoner? Damn, I was thinking maybe people are like me and you've been reading Akhmatova. So Akhmatova, a Soviet woman who wrote about the Great Purge under Stalin, and who spent a long time in the terrible prisons. And in the prelude to her Requiem, which is a very long poem which records the many of those who died under Stalin, she describes it in really simple language, this encounter with a woman in the queue for dinner, which was like watery soup. And the woman was so cold, her lips were blue. And the woman says to Anna Akhmatova, "Can anyone describe this?" And Anna Akhmatova says, "I can." And the woman smiles. And that to me just says everything about the power of poetry, that we can bear witness, and by bearing witness, we have a tremendous power to change the world. Does that fit with your belief in language?
Well, my belief in poetry is what I would like to present is that, you know, it's a form of writing which nobody has any great commercial hopes of. And I think in that lies its redemption and its flourishing.
Oh my God,
Because, you know, if you're an author of a novel that does well, the next one has to be similar to it, and then there are commercial, you know, considerations. But poetry, in my idealistic or relatively idealistic eye, still remains the purest form of literature. You just mentioned this, this entire anecdote about the blue lips and, you know, referenced it in your poem from a very difficult time in Soviet Russian history. So as a poet writing in today's UK, what is it to be a poet in rather difficult, dynamic, quick changing times, and does that slowly, you know, influence your poetry beyond your personal sphere, where you said that too is a major motivation to write?
You know, I'm old school feminist, and I'm new school feminist as well.
Are there so many schools?
Yeah.
In India, we just know there's one school.
The other feminist, and the new feminist, and the future feminist, all here. I'm the feminist that isn't even feminist. I believe that the person is political. I write about what I know and what I can imagine with conviction and authenticity. So when I write about the things that I see, that doesn't mean that I always write about my kind of immediate environs. But when I write about the things that most bother me or I most care about, the things that touch my life, they're inherently political. I don't believe that a word that we utter doesn't have politics in it. I cannot separate myself from the collective. That would be absolutely nonsensical. Everything I do, everything I am, is shaped by, you know, the people that I came from and the people that I live alongside. So how do I reflect difficult times in the UK? Well, I guess because my life, to be honest, has always been marked by difficulty. So I grew up in a very, very deprived town in the north of England, Burnley, in case anybody's heard of Burnley. Some people have heard of the football club. Yeah, oh my God, these nuts! I'm going to take this back to Burnley and they're going to be really thrilled. Yeah,
Soccer connects more than poetry does, sadly.
Yeah, I think it sure does. But yeah, in the UK, so Burnley would be famous for football. It would be famous for very pronounced poverty, industrial deprivation, pit closures, factory closures. It would be famous for ethnic conflict. It would be famous for extreme right-wing politics. It's one of the places in the UK that has most consistently had fascist or far-right representation at a local level. It wouldn't be known for its gay scene, and I grew up in Burnley as a young gay person in a very conservative background. I grew up in a single-parent family with 5 brothers and sisters, where things like money and time and attention and, to be honest, care were in short supply. So I feel that I kind of grew up knowing some of the difficulties that the UK was going through at a very personal level. And as a result of some of the experiences that I had as a child, you know, I've already alluded to the fact that I went on to experience very extreme emotional distress. As a result of that, I spent long times in psychiatric hospitals as a young adult. So a lot of those very difficult experiences have made their way into my poetry. How could they not? How could they not? I always think if we don't write about what most matters to us, or we don't speak about it, it will write itself, it will speak itself anyway. And sometimes what we write or we paint or we present to the world, the negative spaces are the most powerful form. If we don't talk it, it's kind of there shaping us anyway. So I guess my engagement with politics, with the kind of wider social, political, economic reality, has been there right from the very start. I think maybe that's answered your question.
In a way, yes, and in a way, no, because you mentioned you came from a place which I'm guessing would have voted exit in Brexit.
Yeah.
Yes. So the current scenario there, that there is xenophobia at some level. That's a strong word to use, but there's a mild form of it in such parts of the UK. So, at present, do these concerns, I mean, you've moved from that position of a young adult, and now there are current concerns. How do they make their way into your poetry, or do they at all?
Yeah, you talk about mild xenophobia. It's not mild. I would love to kind of repeat some of the language that I grew up with, but I don't actually think I can. I think I'd end up choking. That's the power of language again, isn't it? We talk about Brexit, and anybody here from the UK or anybody who's following UK politics will just feel kind of sleepy in a sort of sick and anxious way if I talk about Brexit. And I think for most of the people that I know, or most of the people that I grew up with, we're not talking about Brexit. To be honest, we're not that bothered. The reason that people in Burnley or Todmorden not so much. You don't know Todmorden. Why am I getting into a debate in my head about Todmorden? That the people in Burnley would have voted for Brexit is because people were angry, people are poor, people have been poor for generations, and people are struggling to get by on a day-by-day level. So those are the things that people are living. They're not living the Brexit debate. They're not going to be talking about Brexit. I would say absolutely that stuff comes into my poetry, but I'm not writing about Brexit because the issue of Brexit is not what fires me up. Injustice, poverty, people being disenfranchised, people being treated as though they're worthless for generation after generation after generation, that fires me up more than the EU.
So now moving from your motivations to your art, you've written poetry, as you said, from an age when it had to express itself, and now you also are a spoken word performer. So when you're writing to be read and when you're writing to perform, what are the differences, what are the places they kind of converge, and what are the points where they diverge?
That's a lovely question, and the unfortunate fact is, although I'm advertised as a performance poet on the programme, I'm not a performance poet, and I'm not a spoken word artist. That's not how I'm understood or kind of received or perceived in the UK. We have these almost ridiculously arbitrary divisions between forms of poetry.
Do you think they're arbitrary? I mean, I would imagine they are, but why do you think they are?
Well, they're arbitrary in the sense that there's a spectrum. So absolutely, there are some forms of poetry that depend upon devices of performance to work. And there are some poems that depend on being on the page to work. The fact that they exist on paper it's where they have to be. And when they're read out, we don't understand them. And the elements of form or structure or layout are lost, and it doesn't work. Likewise, if you're delivering a performance poem that depends on, physical movement or dance or music or kind of verbal trickery or dressing up or any of the things that we might see, at a poetry slam, then absolutely that maybe exists in a different genre to the page poetry. But I think a vast amount of poetry lies somewhere in the middle. And if we think about the fact that poetry has always been spoken or kind of performed art, then it does seem to me rather arbitrary to talk about performance poetry as being very, very distinct to page poetry. So yeah, even though I love to perform, even as a kid growing up, other kids like to play, air guitar or like singing to hairbrushes in front of the mirror. I used to recite poetry in front of the mirror. That was what I loved to do. So, you know, it's a joy to me to be able to read poetry out. I used to love when we did read it out in class. I couldn't wait for the teacher to get to me. And when I write, reading out the poetry is a really important part of the writing process. But despite that, because my poetry is intended for the page, I enjoy reading it. Other people enjoy, I hope, hearing it or reading it out themselves. But it doesn't depend on being read out. I'm not seen as a performance poet. I can't remember your original question, Marla.
It was difference between performance poetry and page poetry, as you call it, and if there is any difference.
I think, yeah, so in some cases there is a profound difference, but in many cases I think it's something to do with labelling. It's something to do with the frame that we put the art in, and if we describe it as performance poetry and we perform it with a certain intonation, in certain venues, you know, maybe with the odd kind of particular piece of vocabulary thrown in, then it's seen as performance poetry. But if it's written for the page, yeah, something quite distinct. And there's all sorts of kind of mannerisms some of you will be familiar with, connected with the world of performance poetry. So I only recently came across clicking. Do people here go to poetry slams, anybody?
Well, we have versions of it in India, but...
you have the clicking thing, the finger clicking?
Yes,
yeah,
we have.
Yeah.
Because last year at my festival, we had this very famous Canadian Indian poet called Rupi Kaur.
Oh my God,
and you know, at 46, I was wondering, why are people doing this every now and this? And then my son, who's 18, told me, Ma, this is the way they do it. Obviously I was so deflated by being so out of this whole clicking your fingers.
You know, I found it out in the last 2 months.
And in India, we have a perfectly nice way of saying, "Wow, wow, kya baat hai," which would do as well as clicking fingers. But you know, these are global phenomena, and who is a mother to contest those? So yes, I think we have a young finger clicking audience here. So you can raise your hand and click your finger if you have a question.
And hissing too, this is a thing. And hissing is a way of showing your appreciation. I'd be a bit scared if I was reading a poem and people started hissing. But it's a way of going, yeah, this is good. We like what you just said. You hiss at somebody.
Well, commendable. Every word that you guys have spoken up on stage today is absolutely commendable. The floor is now open for the audience to raise your questions. I have a question then. So I was wondering, when someone writes poetry or when they go ahead and write their books, there's a certain benchmark that they set, which I feel the current generation feels very burdened with, because they feel they have to live up to a particular standard. So what words of advice could you give them?
Are you expected to write the same poem again and again?
Yeah, or do we have to live up to a particular standard? Or how do you, because we're a generation of constant self-doubt. So what would you tell the current generation?
Well, obviously, we've already established that there's no money in poetry, and that's the kind of value of
Is
the
that liberating in a way?
So the only way I make a living as a poet, I make about 14 pence a year from royalties, and that's that's good going. The only way you make a living as a poet is as a teacher. So a lot of the work that I do is getting other people into writing poetry, and that is what I'm working with consistently, is the idea that a poem is a particular thing, and poets are particular people, and this is not for me, and how could I possibly write in this particular way? This is something for muses and geniuses and all that kind of silly language we create around poetry. I think I made the point yesterday that as a result of some of the experiences that I've described while I've been talking, I've worked for many years now as a trainer around self-injury and suicide in a lot of different settings. So I've worked a lot in psychiatric hospitals, currently still do, and worked a lot in prisons. Psychiatric hospitals and prisons are the two places, I can speak with direct experience from the UK, where the most poetry is written and read the most consistently. This is not an elite art form. You know, people turn to poetry when they're feeling really sad, when they're feeling really happy, when someone's got married, when they've had a baby,
Yep.
when somebody's died. It's a poem that they want, or it's a poem that they write. People don't write novels or create sculptures or make a film. Usually, they write a poem to capture those feelings. So there is something incredibly kind of democratic and accessible about poetry. So in a way, it kind of baffles me that these things happen, that we think of it as an elite art form. So yeah, the very starting point for me, teacher, is to get rid of that. And the way that I usually do that is with working with people around free writing. So writers here familiar with that. So pen on the paper. You know, don't worry about what you're writing. It doesn't matter if you can spell or you can use punctuation or grammar. Who gives a hoot about that? Just keep on writing and write faster than the voices in your head that tell you it's stupid or it's daft or people are going to laugh at you or it doesn't make sense or this is all very embarrassing. Write faster than that. And once people have got into the habit of doing this repeatedly, you will inevitably come up with some gems. And I think that's the really exciting kind of magical part of poetry. When you read back at what you've written and you go, oh my God, did I write that? Sometimes it's because you're a bit worried about yourself.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's because what you've written is so beautiful. So a lot of that work is about getting people to let go of those preconceptions and to come back to a faith in themselves and a faith in the pen. You know, the pen is the most powerful tool.
Yes.
If you put a pen on the page and let it move, if you trust the pen, trust language. We've all been using language since we were, you know, how old? The language will tell you which direction to move in. So kind of giving yourself over to that process.
Thank you for that. Another topic I'd like to touch on, this could be a topic of discussion.
You have a question? I thought I saw a hand.
I'm
Yes.
sorry, yes, please go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I think it was just a lady. Just okay, just somebody waving. Sorry to interrupt
Yes.
you.
So this is a topic of discussion and the audience can please get involved. There are certain topics which we call taboo topics that are not written by or written about by the current audience. What would you say about that?
I think you kind of know what I might say about that. In the last 20 minutes, I've addressed rape, abuse, lesbianism, psychiatric breakdown, institutionalisation, imprisonment. There aren't that many taboos that I'm scared to break.
Yeah.
Because every day, you know, living in the world on an everyday basis as myself involves me breaking taboos.
Yeah.
Breaking taboos has been a matter of survival. So
As
if
a
I
teacher,
didn't
do you
that-
find it hard to communicate that same freedom?
No. I don't find it hard to communicate that same freedom.
Or rather, do your students dither before, you know, writing about topics that are uncomfortable in a way?
Well, it's difficult to know because I think if some people kind of choose to keep silent, I might never know about that. But what I encounter time and time again is tremendous relief when people are enabled and given a safe platform to speak about, you know, issues that they might have struggled to speak about in other settings.
Yeah.
Nobody, I think, likes the feeling of living in silence. And, you know, and true, we all make kind of very pragmatic decisions on a daily basis about what information we share, in what context. You know, we don't share our deepest secrets with the bus driver. That wouldn't be appropriate unless we're married to him or he's a good friend. But living with secrets on a daily basis is really hard work. So when we kind of create a confident, creative, safe space where people can talk about who they are or what they think or what they've been through, I've personally never experienced people kind of feeling negative about that. It's only ever been celebratory and positive, if sometimes a little bit emotional.
Why I ask this question is because I feel that we want to term ourselves as progressive. We're an Indian society that is progressive, but the real question is, are we really progressing? If we can't address taboo topics like sanitary napkins, or if we can't address topics like sexual orientation, and we can't display them in our work, and people are not ready to read that work, then are we really progressing? And as a poet, as a blood axe poet, in fact, what would you like to say? I mean, to a nation that has been developing, we are not developing anymore, we are developed. And with that, having that in mind, what should be the mindset of a millennial today?
Since you're a teacher, you have to tell us.
Yeah.
Speak to the millennials. Do you know what? I would go back to Anna Akhmatova and that blue-lit prisoner, 70 years ago, saying, "Can anyone describe this?" And Anna Akhmatova turning to it and saying, "I can." We can talk about things that might seem frightening beyond description, that might seem unimaginable. Another one of the most kind of powerful pieces of writing that for me is complete guiding philosophy is Muriel, I always get her name wrong, Rukiza. Is it? Can somebody help me out with that pronunciation? Jewish American writer, feminist, socialist, writing from the 50s, 40s, up to the 80s. And she wrote about lots of different things. One of her experiences included being in Spain at the time of the Spanish Civil War as a socialist. And there's this beautiful piece of writing in her book, The Life of Poetry, where she describes being on a boat, sailing away from the Civil War with, all its kind of glory and hopes and bloodshed and horror. And she describes, being on the boat in the ocean and the stars above her and, and what she can hear in her mind's eye. And one of the voices that she hears tells her, "Go home, tell your people what you have seen." And that's her obligation that she then lives by, is to tell what she's seen. And I think that is one of our kind of primary obligations. Tell what you've seen, tell who you are, tell what you see on a daily basis, tell what you see happening to other people. Tell it. If we can't tell that...
Do you think poetry is equipped better? This is a recurring thing in what you've said, because you've spoken about the blue-lipped woman and the poet's promise to her to memorialize that. Similarly, the poet you're speaking about now. Mm-hmm. So do you feel that's a kind of responsibility, that your muse is that responsibility in a way?
Yeah, because I think, like, as you say, poetry is peculiarly, that's a very hard word to say, well equipped to speaking about difficult or complicated subjects. Because it's a difficult and complicated language. It's a language where we use absolutely every element that we have available to us. So we're not just working with meaning. The title of this session is The World in a Word. We're not just working with meaning, we're working with kind of association and rhythm and space and echo and the space between words and the space around words and the interplay between words. And illusion and juxtaposition and contradiction and the kind of word roots and cultural salience and personal sense. And that's just in individual words. We work consciously with all elements of language. So poetry is an unusually kind of careful, detailed, microscopically focused art form in terms of language. And because of that, and because it's not just kind of incredibly focused, it also dips into something that's very wild and very uncontrolled. The magic or the alchemy of poetry is something to do with the unconscious, something to do with that part of you when you read back your work and you go, "Oh my God, did I write this, or was it someone else?" So you're using this very, very detailed focus, but you're also allowing in something that's very deep and passionate. And I think that form of writing is very, very well suited to talking about, for example, trauma. If we think about trauma, it's not a story that we can tell chronologically. It doesn't work in terms of a straightforward linear narrative. It will be fractured, it will have gaps, it will have contradictions. Poetry is a particularly kind of suited language that's suited to trauma.
Yes, sir, please.
As much as I really love what you're saying, but I would continuing a question as well. How do you address privilege? Like, how does one address one's privilege? In the sense, like, how do you address different kind of bodies, say brown body, a laboring body, say considering like the.
Now you have the mic, use it.
I don't know if
It's on, right?
Yeah. So like my question was like how does one considering different type of polities, how does one address their own privilege? Like
How are we able to recognize our own
no,
privilege?
not
from it?
recognize, how do you address it?
Address it, okay.
Like considering like how do you one example would be how do you address different kinds of bodies, for example a brown body or a laboring body, a brown body or a laboring body, or like continuing again her question about the taboos and how definitely as much as I love what you're saying, how it was not difficult for you, but like how does one address their own privilege,
Yeah. Outside of language. That's a really agonising question, and it has been agonising me today, because I've never been to India before. I grew up in with very visible kind of poverty and deprivation around me. You can't walk through a city in the UK today and not witness that. It's become much more visible and much more kind of shocking in the last 2 or 3 years as a result of austerity and the Tory government. And if you're walking past somebody who's lying on the street, what difference does it make to them that you write poetry that witnesses their poverty? What difference does it make to them that I acknowledge my privilege, as somebody who is good with words, and that's allowed me to make a career that pays relatively well. And do you know what, mate? I don't know if I can answer. It struck me the irony, and Lincoln's sitting here on the front row, that we're going back,
Do you feel privileged?
Yeah, of course I feel privileged. I'm staying in a 5-star
considering
hotel.
we are also in this privileged setting right here, right now.
Yeah. Look, I'm sitting on a flaming stage. I'm going back to luxury that, is just absolutely hilariously mind-blowing. I've flown over on a flight from the UK on a business class plane.
These are all in the context of this particular festival, your current position. But when you're writing, when you're at the desk, when you're putting pen to paper, do you feel privileged when you are writing poetry? Right now, we're all feeling privileged, except me, perhaps, because I had to step in last minute for the session.
Even the people in economy class.
So what you feel then is when the question will be answered. When you're sitting there, do you feel privileged?
Yeah, I do.
Recognizing, obviously difficult, but addressing it even harder. How do I address my privilege? I'm still struggling.
And I don't think, of course I do, I live in a nice little town. I own my own house. I have a regular income. It's a good income. Of course I feel privileged. I feel really, I do a job that I love. And part of the work that I do involves working with people who do jobs that they hate on a daily basis, for a fraction of the wages that I get. Of course I feel privileged. And I don't think that the work that I do in language is enough. I think there is an obligation to do more than that. And different people will make different decisions about what they do. But language isn't enough. Of course it's not. Thank you.
So yesterday we had a very interesting session called Can Trump Spell Diaspora? And I want to know your opinion on migrant literature. And so when the whole concept of immigration and authors who are immigrants, and do you think that there's a particular inspiration for them? Does it work in their advantage, or is it a disadvantage? And the way Trump is, does it affect them? I don't mean it badly, by the way.
Of course you mean it badly. There's no need to cover up?
Okay, I do.
Mean it
Great
as-
question.
as very aggressively badly as you like. Yes, of course. If we think about the patterns of publication and access to exposure and money and incomes in the poetry world in the UK, absolutely, it's predominantly white, it's predominantly middle class. In terms of gender, we now have lots more women, but we don't have women necessarily in positions of power making decisions around kind of editing or publication. So of course, the poetry world reflects the kind of structural inequalities that we see in society at a national and global level.
Yep. Do you have anything to add?
There's a question.
Yes, sir.
I would just like to push back a little bit against that, because earlier we were talking about the spectrum of poetry and the performative aspects and the written word aspects. And if you look at popular music for the last 50 or 60 years in the UK, in the United States, and as it's spread around the world, that is all poetry. And that has given voice to many people who are not white men. It started with the British invasion because you had to start everything and colonize everybody. But from that, particularly in the United States, we have lots of minorities, lots of women who have been in the forefront of popular culture, but writing what can only be described as poetry, because they are in fact lyrics.
You say, Lincoln, it can only be described as poetry, but are other people describing it as poetry? Are those people here at this event? The only kind of representative that we've got that comes anywhere near that art form is Bo, and Bo doesn't perform.
Yep.
And Bo's a white guy from Australia who writes for the internet. So yeah, you're absolutely right. The kind of divisions we make around poetry are arbitrary to say the least. And maybe some of those kind of genres and hierarchies of power within the poetry world, again, are part of the reflection of structural inequalities. Because we've started with, absolutely correctly recognising that the form of poetry that's most lauded, most kind of valued and respected is poetry that's written for the page, that maybe follows kind of more classical forms, that maybe doesn't address social or political kind of realities. That's seen as poetry at its purest and its most artistic. And often that's the kind of poetry that we'll see reflected in terms of funding grants or lectureships or professorships or at festivals. At festivals like this. But yeah, there's a whole world of poetry that people are creating in the spoken word community or in rap or kind of music that isn't getting access to this world.
Yeah.
But we can look to Bo Taplin, am I saying his name
Taplin,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Who I spoke with yesterday, who has 600,000 followers on Instagram. He doesn't need an Arts Council funding grant. He's got 600,000 followers. He's making his own money. But there's a whole argument then about the respect that he gets as an artist.
Yep.